Steven Seagal's open right hand shot across Johnny Carson's desk toward Chuck Norris's face, but Chuck's left forearm came up instantly and blocked it with the same outside defense he had practiced thousands of times over the years. The strike stopped just inches from his face. Ed McMahon froze with his coffee halfway to his mouth, and Johnny Carson remained completely still. Only moments earlier, Chuck had joked that Steven couldn't hit him no matter how hard he tried. The audience laughed, but Seagal didn't. What followed became one of the most talked about stories that neither man would ever publicly discuss. Earlier that morning, Chuck had been training at his dojo in Sherman Oaks when his friend Bob Wall walked in with troubling news. Bob told Chuck that Steven Seagal had been telling people Chuck didn't know what a real fight was. Chuck calmly listened, asked why Bob was bringing it up now, and Bob explained that Seagal would be appearing on Johnny Carson's show the same night. Chuck stared at him for a moment, then turned back to the heavy bag and continued training without another word. He believed life had a way of dealing with these things on its own. That evening, Chuck arrived at NBC and waited in the green room. His publicist sat beside him while a pot of untouched coffee rested on the table. He hadn't seen Seagal because the producers had placed them in separate green rooms, making sure they wouldn't cross paths before the show. Chuck simply accepted the arrangement and watched Seagal's interview on the monitor. Seagal walked onto the stage to polite applause. He wore a black silk shirt buttoned neatly to the top and sat down without acknowledging Ed McMahon. Ed noticed immediately. During the interview, Seagal spoke softly and confidently about his martial arts background, claiming years of training in Japan and describing experiences that many people had questioned over the years. He hinted at secret operations and real combat experience but offered few details. Johnny Carson listened carefully, asking measured questions while quietly observing every word and every expression. Eventually the conversation shifted toward the difference between movie martial arts and real fighting. Seagal explained that what audiences usually saw in action films was simply sport with rules and limitations. According to him, real combat was completely different because there were no rules when someone truly wanted to hurt you. The audience reacted with quiet curiosity as Carson carefully watched his guest. Then Carson casually mentioned that Chuck Norris would be joining the show next. Seagal's expression changed almost instantly. He smiled and described Chuck as a friend before adding that Chuck was a good movie fighter. Carson immediately noticed the wording. Instead of simply praising Chuck, Seagal had drawn a line between entertainment and what he claimed was genuine combat. He continued by saying there was a difference between what looked good on screen and what actually worked in a real fight, making it clear that he believed his own style belonged in the second category. Carson paused and looked directly at him before asking whether Chuck should be given the chance to respond once he came out. Seagal calmly answered that no response was necessary because Chuck already knew exactly where he stood. Carson let the silence linger for a moment before cutting to a commercial break. Backstage, Chuck's publicist watched his face carefully, searching for any reaction after hearing Seagal's comments. Chuck remained completely calm. A few moments later, Doc Severinsen's band welcomed Chuck onto the stage with a much louder reception from the audience. Chuck smiled, waved politely, shook Johnny Carson's hand, and took his seat. Seagal stayed where he was and never stood up to greet him. Carson welcomed Chuck back and explained that they had just been discussing the difference between martial arts for movies and martial arts for real-life situations. Chuck immediately understood the tension in the room, but instead of creating an argument, he chose humor. He turned toward Seagal with a friendly smile and joked that Steven couldn't hit him even if he tried. The audience laughed, Ed McMahon laughed, and Carson smiled while looking down at his cue cards, expecting the moment to pass like any other playful exchange between guests. But Seagal never laughed. Instead, silence filled the studio. After a long pause, he quietly asked Chuck to repeat what he had just said. The laughter disappeared instantly. Chuck realized Seagal had taken the joke personally and tried to calm the situation by explaining that it had only been a joke. Seagal disagreed, insisting that Chuck had challenged him publicly in front of the entire country. Chuck made one more attempt to end the confrontation peacefully, reminding Seagal that Johnny Carson had a show to run and that they should simply move on. The atmosphere inside the studio had completely changed. Every person in the audience could sense that something unusual was unfolding. Seagal remained focused on Chuck, his expression cold and unchanging. Then, without warning, he reached across Johnny Carson's desk with an open-handed strike aimed directly at Chuck's face. It was fast enough to make contact but controlled enough that it could later be dismissed as nothing more than a gesture. Chuck reacted instantly. His left forearm rose with perfect timing, stopping the strike just inches from his face. He never hit back. He simply held Seagal's wrist for a brief moment, looked him directly in the eyes, and calmly released it. The silence inside the studio was overwhelming. Ed McMahon had stopped in the middle of taking a sip of coffee. Johnny Carson's pen remained frozen above his cue cards as he watched the confrontation unfold. Chuck quietly asked Seagal to sit down and let the show continue, but Seagal refused. He demanded time to defend his reputation, insisting that Chuck had challenged him in front of millions of viewers. Carson reminded him they were broadcasting live, hoping to calm the situation, but Seagal ignored the warning. Instead, he stepped away from the desk and walked into the open space between the audience and the stage, clearly inviting Chuck to face him. Chuck looked toward Carson and apologized for what was happening before slowly standing up. He walked into the open area with complete confidence, keeping his hands relaxed at his sides instead of taking a fighting stance. Seagal positioned himself with an Aikido posture, placing most of his weight on his back leg while keeping his hands open and ready. Several long seconds passed as both men studied one another. The control room debated whether to cut to a commercial break, but producer Fred DeCordova decided to let the cameras continue rolling. He understood that whatever happened next would become unforgettable television. Seagal finally made the first move. He reached for Chuck's wrist using an Aikido grip he had demonstrated earlier during his interview. Chuck allowed the grip without resisting. As Seagal began rotating Chuck's wrist into a traditional joint lock, Chuck calmly stepped forward, turned with the movement, and reversed the technique with flawless precision. Within an instant, Seagal found himself trapped by his own technique. His knees buckled, and he dropped onto one knee in front of the audience. Chuck maintained the lock for only a second before immediately releasing it and stepping backward, giving Seagal every opportunity to end the confrontation peacefully. Most professionals would have accepted the gesture, stood up, and walked away with what dignity they had left. Seagal chose differently. He rose to his feet and launched a powerful hammer fist strike toward Chuck's head. Chuck slipped the attack effortlessly, moving only a few inches as the strike passed harmlessly through the air. Again, Chuck refused to counterattack. He remained composed, allowing Seagal another chance to stop. Instead, Seagal attacked again, this time with an overhead knife hand strike similar to the technique he had proudly demonstrated earlier during his interview. Chuck recognized it immediately. Rather than moving away, he stepped inside the attack, closing the distance before the strike could develop any real power. He caught Seagal's wrist with one hand while placing his open palm gently against Seagal's chest. It wasn't a strike. It was simply a reminder that he could have ended the fight at any moment if he had chosen to do so. Every camera in the studio captured the quiet moment as Seagal looked down at Chuck's hand resting against his chest. Realizing his stand-up attacks had failed, Seagal abandoned his original style and attempted to grab Chuck's leg like a wrestler shooting for a takedown. Chuck reacted immediately with a perfect sprawl, shifting his weight backward and forcing Seagal down to the carpet. Within seconds, Seagal found himself on his hands and knees while Chuck controlled the position from above. Chuck had several ways to finish the encounter if he wanted to, but he chose none of them. Instead, he stepped away once more, leaving Seagal free to stand on his own. For a brief moment, Seagal remained on his hands and knees in front of the audience, his shirt untucked and his composure gone. Chuck extended his hand, offering to help him back to his feet. It was a simple gesture of respect and an opportunity to put the confrontation behind them. Seagal looked at the hand for several seconds but refused to take it. He stood by himself, adjusted his clothing, avoided eye contact with both Chuck and Johnny Carson, and walked off the stage without saying another word. The audience sat in stunned silence before finally erupting into emotional applause and disbelief. Even Doc Severinsen's orchestra hesitated, unsure whether to begin playing. Carson stared at the empty chair for a moment before calmly announcing a commercial break. Behind the scenes, producers rushed onto the stage while the scheduled 2-minute break was extended to allow everyone time to recover from what had just happened. When the show returned, Chuck Norris was the only guest remaining. Carson continued the interview as though nothing unusual had occurred. Chuck spoke about his latest film, his martial arts journey, his childhood, and the lessons he had learned throughout his life. Despite everything that had happened, he never criticized Seagal or even mentioned his name. Carson also avoided bringing the confrontation back into the conversation, allowing the interview to end with professionalism rather than controversy. Later that night, Chuck received a phone call from Bob Wall asking whether he wanted him to respond publicly or make a few calls regarding the incident. Chuck calmly declined, saying that Steven had made his own decisions and would have to live with the consequences himself. The following morning, Seagal's representatives contacted NBC, demanding that the confrontation be removed from future broadcasts. While the live broadcast had already reached millions of viewers, later international versions were reportedly edited before being distributed.